Most parents think discipline is supposed to change their child's behavior, but that's not all it changes. Every behavior your child has that drives you crazy, it started somewhere. Your kid didn't just wake up one day and said, you know what, I think I'm going to be a butt. It started with one moment, one interaction, one response from you that your child remembered. And then it happened again and again until it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like just the way things happen in your house. That's a pattern. And most parents have never traced the behaviors they're dealing with today back to the learning process that created them. That learning process is called discipline. But here's the part most parents never recognize until the pattern gets big. Discipline doesn't only produce the behavior you see right now. Patterns don't just repeat, they grow. They spread into behaviors that you didn't expect and they head somewhere, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Today, I'm going to show you what happens when a pattern grows, how discipline can produce two completely different directions, where those directions lead, and what happens when other people start reinforcing what your child has learned. My name is Scott. I taught martial arts for 35 years. I have worked with thousands of kids, interacted with tens of thousands of parents, and raised 3 kids of my own when I was just 19. And I'm telling you what I saw and how I came to understand how discipline works. So let's get into it. Now, before we go any further, I need to explain something that I'm going to use throughout this video, a term. It's a concept called a pivot point. Now, a pivot point is a moment a decision is made. That's it. It's the exact moment where you choose one direction or the other. Every time your child wants something and you have to decide how to respond, that's a pivot point. Every time they push you and you either give in or hold the line, that's a pivot point. It almost always comes down to two options. Am I going to do this or am I going to do that? Two directions, and whichever direction you choose teaches your child something about how the world works. Every pivot point creates a lesson, and every lesson reinforced becomes a pattern, and every pattern going to lead somewhere. That's why pivot points matters. They look small in the moment, but they're the building blocks of everything I'm about to show you. And most parents think they have a kid with a lot of bad behaviors, but they don't. They have a kid with one technique that worked, so the kid built more. Now here's what I mean. A baby has one tool, crying. That's it. That's their entire bag of techniques for getting what they want. But every time that technique works, the baby learns something. And as the baby grows, they get smarter, more capable, and they start developing language. Every new ability gives them a new technique to test, so the bag gets bigger. Like crying becomes whining, whining becomes demanding, demanding becomes tantrums, tantrums become arguing, arguing becomes manipulation, manipulation becomes entitlement, and entitlement becomes defiance. Every one of those is a different behavior, but every one of those is just a more advanced version of the same thing. A technique designed to get what they want. That's the funnel. One technique at the narrow end, dozens of techniques at the wide end, and every single one of them traces back to the same pivot point. The moment the parent responded to the first push, and the child learned that pushing works. And here's why that matters to you as a parent. Every one of those techniques requires a response from you. Every tantrum is a decision you have to make. Every argument is a pivot point. Every act of defiance is another moment where you have to choose how you're going to respond. That's why parenting starts to feel overwhelming. You're not dealing with 20 different problems. You're dealing with 20 different versions of the same problem. A kid testing techniques to get what they want. And every new technique they develop is one more thing on your plate. The monster got bigger. And remember, the child isn't the monster. The parent isn't the monster. The behavior is the monster. And you got to eliminate the monster while it's little. And here's something interesting that most parenting content doesn't talk about. The parent. You see, the funnel doesn't only happen inside the child. It opens inside the parent too. At first, the parent gives in because they want the crying to stop. Then giving in becomes avoiding conflict, and avoiding conflict becomes rescuing the child. Rescuing becomes making excuses become blaming the teacher, the coach, or the other kid. And eventually, the parent may begin defending the kid from the very consequences that could teach them. The parent started by protecting the child from one uncomfortable moment, but the pattern grew until the parent began protecting the pattern itself. Both funnels opened at the same pivot point. Both funnels expanded together, and the whole time, both of them were still learning. Discipline was still happening. Discipline just means to learn or be taught. It was teaching the wrong lessons. Now let's look at the other direction. The parent who held the line when the pattern was small didn't eliminate the funnel. The funnel still opens. The kid still has to develop techniques, but the techniques are completely different because the kid learned that pushing doesn't work. They have to find something that does. And that means they have to develop a different bag of techniques. How to ask instead of demand, how to wait instead of tantrum, how to accept the word no instead of argue, how to control themselves instead of escalate. Those are life skills, and each one is a technique the child can actually use, not just to get what they want, but to navigate the world. Now that funnel opens too, but what comes out of it's completely different. Not tantrums, but self-control. Not manipulation, a better way to communicate. Not entitlement, but gratitude. Not defiance, respect. And a different pattern develops inside the parent too. Holding the line becomes consistency. Consistency builds confidence. Confidence makes the next decision easier. The parent gets more comfortable leading and less afraid of the child's tantrum or temporary discomfort. And here's the difference you feel as a parent. The first set of techniques is exhausting to deal with. Every day is another fire. Every technique your child develops in that direction is one more behavior you're going to have to manage. One more battle you have to fight. One more decision that drains you. The second set of techniques is manageable. Not because parenting becomes easy, but because a child who asks, waits, communicates, and controls himself doesn't generate the same chaos. You're not putting out fires, you're building character. Both have the same starting point, the same pivot point, but two completely different bags of techniques, two completely different behavior funnels, and both of them are still growing every day. But a funnel only shows you what expands. It doesn't show you where the expansion is heading. For that, you have to look at the trajectory. Now, most parents think the problem is the behavior they're dealing with today, but that's not accurate. The behavior is just where they happen to be standing on a trajectory or a direction that's been building for years. The funnel showed you how one technique becomes many, but those techniques aren't just multiplying, they're heading somewhere. Every technique your child develops points in a direction, and that direction keeps going. Now, there are two basic trajectories, and every lesson your child has learned, every technique they've developed is pointing toward one of those two trajectories. Now, the first is wants-based. The child spent years developing techniques to get what they want, like crying, whining, tantrums, manipulation, defiance. Every technique that worked got reinforced. Every technique that got reinforced became part of how the child operates. Now picture that child at puberty. They've been refining those techniques for over a decade. They're good at this. They know how to lie to avoid consequences. They know how to manipulate a situation to get what they want. They know how to blow up when things don't go their way because blowing up has always worked. And the parent's life is constant drama. Every single day, there's a new crisis, something at school or a friend or social media, an argument at dinner, a lie that unravels a consequence the child refuses to accept. The parent is exhausted. They feel like they never stop putting out fires. And here's what I watched happen with some of those parents. They got used to the drama. It became normal. Some of them even started to feel like the drama meant they were doing the work. They were busy. They were involved. They were dealing with things. But busy isn't building anything. Busy is just running in circles, managing the same pattern that's been growing since the first pivot point. The drama isn't progress. It's the trajectory producing exactly what it was always going to produce. A child on a wants-based trajectory doesn't suddenly change at puberty. They accelerate because now they have more freedom, more access, more capability, and a whole friend group reinforcing the same techniques that they have been working on since they were little. The trajectory was easier in the beginning and devastating when it arrives at puberty. Now let's look at the other direction. The child spent years developing life skills like patience, honesty, self-control, better communication, responsibility. Each one is a technique they can actually use to navigate hard situations without creating chaos. Now picture that child at puberty. They're still going to struggle. Every teenager struggles, but they have more than one way to respond when things get hard. They don't have to lie because they learn that honesty is less costly than deception, even when the truth is uncomfortable. They don't have to blow up because they've practiced self-control enough times that it's available to them when they feel pressure. They don't have to manipulate because they know how to communicate what they actually need. They don't collapse when the world doesn't give them what they want because they were never taught that the world was supposed to. And the parent's life looks completely different too, not because problems disappear, but because the daily experience of parenting isn't constant drama. There are no fires to put out every day. There are conversations. There are real questions about real decision. There's a teenager who still needs guidance, but a teenager who has something inside them that's easy to guide. The parent isn't busy. The parent is building, and there's a difference. The trajectory was harder. This trajectory is harder in the beginning, but easier the rest of their life. Same starting point, same pivot point, same battle of once, two completely different outcomes. By the time you can clearly see where the trajectory is heading, it's already been building for years. The behaviors you're dealing with today didn't start today. They started with something your child learned at a pivot point that you probably don't even remember. But the trajectory remembers, and it keeps moving. The question is, how long do you have before someone else begins reinforcing the techniques that your child has already learned? There's one more thing that both trajectories build: character, or if you prefer, identity. The child who spends years learning pressure, manipulation, excuses, and blame doesn't just know those techniques. They begin seeing themselves in the world through those techniques. The child who spends years learning honesty, patience, responsibility, and self-control begins seeing themselves through those life skills. That's who they're becoming. And that's why the next section matters, because people naturally surround themselves with people who reinforce like who your child thinks they are. People that are similar, people that think like them and act like them. Now, most parents think their child's friends are the problem, but that's not really true. The friends are just an amplifier. Now, here's what I mean. By the time your kid starts choosing their own friends, the trajectory has already been established. The pattern has been building for years. Your child already knows what works at home. They already know how they respond to discomfort. They already know whether pushing gets results or whether life skills get results. They have already learned a way of operating. That learned way of operating is their discipline. And they naturally gravitate toward people who operate the same way. A child on a wants-based trajectory finds friends who reinforce wants, friends who push boundaries, friends who avoid responsibility, friends who tell them what they want to hear, friends who make excuses with them. A child on a life skills-based trajectory finds friends who reinforce life skills, friends who challenge them, who are honest with them, friends who value the same things they were taught to value. The friend group didn't create the direction. The friend group found a direction that already existed and turned up the volume. That's amplification. And this is why so many parents feel like they lost their kids during the teenage years. They didn't lose them during the teenage years. They lost control of the trajectory years before that. The teenage years just made it loud enough to hear. By the time a parent says it's those friends, the trajectory has been running since the first battle of wants. The friends didn't build the road. Your child was already walking in it. The friends just started walking it with them. That's why I believe you have a window from birth to puberty. That's your greatest opportunity to establish the learning process your child's going to carry forward. Because once outside influences start reinforcing the direction, your voice just becomes one of many. And if your child's discipline is wants-based, your voice will be the one they want to hear the least because you're the one saying no. And they've already found a whole group of people who say yes. But if your child is discipline is life skills based, your voice still matters. Not because you need to make their decisions for them, but because you built something inside them that recognized your voice as the one who told them the truth. The problem was never just the friends. The friends simply amplify the discipline that was built before their friends showed up. Now, most parents think the battle is about the cookie or the toy or the bedtime or the attitude or the back talk. It was never about any of those things. Those were just pivot points. Those are the moments you decided the direction your parenting was going to go. The real battle has always been about what your child was learning and where that learning was taking them. That's discipline. Remember, discipline just means to learn or be taught. Every time your child wanted something and you had to decide how to respond, a lesson was being taught. Your child was learning and you were learning too. That wasn't only a behavior problem, that was a direction being established. And the direction was either being built around what your child wanted or around the life skills your child needed. If you're a parent looking at your child right now wondering how things got this hard, stop looking only at the behavior. Trace it back, find the pattern, find the pivot point, find the lesson both of you learned in that moment. That's where the pattern started. And that's where the learning process can start to change. You can't do it by managing 20 different behaviors. You can start to fix it by changing the one pattern underneath all of them. One response, one precedent, one new lesson, one new direction. That's all it takes to begin bending the trajectory in a better direction. I know that's hard to hear, and I know some of you are thinking it might be too late, but it's never too late. The same way one wrong pivot point can begin a pattern that grows into the behaviors you're dealing with today, one better pivot point can begin a new pattern. It won't erase the old one overnight, but the trajectory can bend. I've watched it happen. Heck, I've done it a whole bunch of times. The parent who wakes up and says, I'm done managing behaviors, I'm going to start teaching life skills, is a parent who just reached a pivot point of their own. They're testing a new response against reality. They're learning what works, and that's discipline too. Because discipline is never just for your child, it was always for both of you. Now, my name is Scott Wilkinson. Again, I taught martial arts for 35 years. I've worked with thousands of kids. I raised 3 kids of my own starting when I was 19. I'm just telling you how I did what I did. And I watched this play out in thousands of parents and kids over the course of my career. If you liked it, share it with your friends and subscribe to Foundations of Character, and I will see you next time.